So I wanted to do a video on a question I got from a reader, which I thought was quite interesting. I've posted the question here, so you can see in the chat. Um, the question is: with all the talk of George H.W. Bush's resume unfolding naturally toward the presidency, it's easy to forget the Nixon appointment to the UN after he lost his second U.S. Senate campaign in 1970. Arguably, that's what kept him in the game, right? So I think that this is a very interesting question. How uh, and some background of the question beforehand. So Bush had gotten elected to Congress in um, uh, in 1966, and he got onto the Ways and Means Committee, despite the fact that he was first term congressman. Ways and Means is perhaps the most powerful committee. And then what happened is basically, Bush got reelected in '68, and then Richard Nixon is now president. He was elected in '68, and obviously Nixon wanted to build up a bench of loyal, competent people in the Senate. And so Nixon asked Bush whether he'd be willing to give up his House seat and run for the Senate in Texas against then Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was a harsh critic of Nixon. So Bush thought about it, and he agreed to do it. He ran in 1970 for the Senate, gave up his House seat, and then he lost. But because he had sort of gone back and run for office at the president's behest, Nixon obviously felt a certain degree of loyalty to him, and so he rewarded Bush with a prominent appointment. He made him a permanent representative to the UN. And then from there, basically, Bush went on to have a series of prominent appointments. Between from the Nixon years all the way through the Ford years. And this culminated in Bush being the CIA director. He remained in the job through the Ford administration. And then after Ford lost him in '76, he went back to Texas and then began to run for president. And ran against Ronald Reagan in 1980, then became Reagan's vice president. I think now I found this to be very interesting because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I also used to think about this a lot back when I was working for Rumsfeld on his memoir, because it was always an interesting thing to me. Why did George H.W. Bush become president and not Rumsfeld? And basically, Bush and Rumsfeld had a sort of rivalry, and they were both broadly on track to potentially going down this route and becoming president. So what ended up happening basically was that around the same time that Nixon was trying to convince Bush to run for Senate, he was doing a very similar thing with Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld too had gotten elected to Congress at a young age, and then he ended up also resigning from Congress in 1969 to go into the Nixon administration, and he had a number of different appointments. So in the early '70s, Nixon tried to convince Rumsfeld to go back to Illinois and run for Senate. And when they would talk about Rumsfeld's career and different jobs that he could have in the administration, they were both cognizant of how Rumsfeld's experience in the administration, how it might bear on his aspirations to be a senator in Illinois. And this was a serious proposition that Rumsfeld might go back and run for Senate. Like, I remember when I was working for Rumsfeld, I went over to his house in Maryland, and he still had these old bumper stickers, Rumsfeld for Senate. So the campaign, there was planning. This wasn't simply idle chatter. So Rumsfeld basically had two opportunities to run for the Senate. One was, the first one came in 1974. Let me just make sure I have this timing right. So the first one was opportunity was in 1974. Rumsfeld was at that time the U.S. ambassador to NATO, and he would have had the Republican nomination to go up against Adlai Stevenson. And then Rumsfeld demurred. He decided instead to remain at NATO, and then he ended up going into the Ford administration. And then he got another opportunity to run for the Senate in 1986. This also would have been, let me make sure I have this. Yeah, so this one would have been against Alan Dixon. Now, it's a very interesting counterfactual here because, Rumsfeld sort of makes a note of this in passing in his memoir. He says that, Nixon would try to get me to run for Senate. I would always kind of demur. But then he throws in a line in his memoir. He says, Nixon did convince Bush to run for the Senate 1970, and he lost. Now, in one sense, Rumsfeld made absolutely the correct decision not to run for the Senate. 1974 was an absolutely brutal year for Republicans. They just got crushed both in the House and Senate, and it would have been an uphill battle, to say the least, to try to beat Adlai Stevenson. And then when you look at how Rumsfeld's career ended up unfolding, it was remarkable. He became, just within a very short time, in addition to getting a lot done at NATO, he ended up becoming Ford's chief of staff. And then he became Secretary of Defense under Ford at a very young age. But then you have to wonder, okay, so why did Bush and not Rumsfeld end up becoming president? At the time when Bush was CIA director, the conventional wisdom was basically that Bush's presidential aspirations were done. That basically he, by becoming CIA director, now he had to, basically the thought was that this was effectively the end of his national aspirations. And whereas people thought Rumsfeld would be much better positioned at that point to make a run for the presidency. Now, this Bush-Rumsfeld rivalry sort of comes to the fore when Ronald Reagan clinches the nomination in 1980, and he's thinking about who to have for his running mate. And both Bush and Rumsfeld wanted it. They were in contention. But ultimately, Reagan ended up going with Bush. And obviously, this just gave Bush a huge leg up. He was a loyal vice president. And then because the Reagan years went so well, Bush was obviously the front runner in 1988. And Rumsfeld just had an uphill battle at that point to try to... He ended up sort of exploring a run for the presidency in 1988, but it just didn't... It wasn't enough to take on Bush. And so what I think the lesson here is that I hear a lot of... I meet a lot of people who are younger and into politics. A lot of my friends who are open to the idea of running for office in some capacity. They want to do it, but then they just never get around to doing it. And a big part of the reason is that they end up moving to Washington. They end up having a series of appointments. in Washington. They appear to be powerful jobs. They're interesting. They're fun, and then they don't have too much of a risk. I mean, yeah, you might have to go through a Senate confirmation, but at the end of the day, it's an insider's game. You have your network, your connections. You get appointed. You have a fun job, and then you get out and you can do other things. And for that reason, people a lot of times just can't get themselves to go and run for office. Now, obviously, I don't think that people ought to be running for office. And I think obviously if you're going to do this, you have to do so with the mindset of being a diligent representative for your constituents and so forth. But I think far too often I've seen people who, on the one hand, overestimate the value of being in a prominent appointed position in Washington, where your influence and power is basically limited to the constraints of the position itself, which are usually pretty trivial. And then on top of that, your fate is largely determined by the president you're serving under and the cabinet secretaries and just the political dynamics in the country. And I've now worked on a number of these books and worked with a number of senior people in government of all varying positions, various personalities, various rates of success. And I can say that if I were to say what the one common denominator is that I found, not only of the people I've worked with, but also with other memoirs I've read. I can't even count at this point how many memoirs I've read. I would say that the closest thing I found a commonality is how powerless these people feel. I mean, you see these people, they appear to have enormous power in government, but they're constantly just struck by how little ability they have to do anything, how little appointment power they have, how little budgetary authority they have, how they're constantly engaged in different fighting. And this is not terribly surprising. I mean, this is how democratic governments work. The whole thing is based off of checks and balances. So on the one hand, I think, and by the way, I'll say too that if you look at, obviously there are plenty of people who can find a way to cash out or use as a platform their government experience. There are also plenty of people who, they're in these high-profile positions, and then you see what they're doing just a year later out of office. And it's a pretty actually dismal thing a lot of them end up being a part of. But then on the other hand, so they overestimate the value of appointed positions, but then they underestimate, or rather overestimate, the opportunity cost and the risk of actually running for elected office. And I think that especially when you do it at the behest of the president or a party leader or whatever, when you run for office, I mean, there's one scenario is that you win and then you get all the perks of being an elected office. And this is what I think is the secret to George H.W. Bush's political success. Whether he or not he calculated it or realized it, he was the beneficiary of being a political candidate who loses. Because when you think about what happened with George H.W. Bush and what happens generally when you run for office. Okay, so first of all, you're now you're doing it at the behest of the president. So now he owes you for making a career sacrifice. Then you have to go out and raise a bunch of money. So this is an opportunity to get to know a lot of prominent people, wealthy people who now, even if they say no, they're grateful that you reached out to them and they feel indebted to you. Alan Simpson actually made this point in Bush's eulogy. Bush called him to get his endorsement in his 1980 run. Simpson had already committed to Reagan, but this helped cement their friendship. And then you go and actually run, and two things happen here. One is that you lay down roots in a certain area. You end up building a constituency and a following. Then the other thing is that running for office and being an elected official is a skill and something that you just develop an intuition of. Like anything else, you practice, you get better at it. So you can see how, by the time now both Bush and Rumsfeld are getting to the point, they've reached the top of their fields in some respects. They're now both thinking about becoming president. I think Rumsfeld was a much closer ideological fit to Ronald Reagan. And I think that, obviously I'm biased, but I think that there was a very strong argument to be made that Rumsfeld was the more qualified choice for the vice presidency. And I'm not the only one who believes this. Milton Friedman later said that Rumsfeld was the right guy, and he even went as far as to say it was Reagan's biggest mistake. And yet, it's not terribly surprising that Reagan did end up picking Bush, because Bush had this one major credential that Rumsfeld didn't have, was that he ran for Senate in 1970. So he obviously went through that whole process, was just more skilled, had more of an intuition of elected politics, and then more importantly, he ran for president in 1980. And it's easy to think in hindsight, well, of course Bush did well in 1980. But when you really look at this 1977, 1978, 1979 period, early on, I mean, Bush's poll numbers were absolutely dismal. I mean, if I remember correctly, the only sort of top-flight political talent who would even was willing to work for George H.W. Bush was James Baker, and even then, I mean, they had this friendship. He almost didn't have a choice. But because Bush ran for the presidency in 1980 and did well, he now had a major constituency. He represented the moderate establishment wing of the party. He showed that he could gain traction electorally. So even if Reagan didn't particularly like him or think he'd be a good governing partner, there was an obvious impetus and logic for picking a guy who had been in the game, had a constituency, had a name brand, compared to Rumsfeld, who the last time he ran for elected office was in the 60s. And then even though he had been an effective bureaucrat, policymaker, etc., to go from that, and then now, even though he had done well in the private sector, to go from being a Washington policymaker, a bureaucrat, to then being a CEO, to then trying to wage a run for the presidency, especially in this era where mass media was becoming more sophisticated and whatever, it's an uphill battle. So, I think anyway, I think Bush's career is fascinating. I think, and I would say in terms of drawing lessons from it, I think there are a couple here. I think one is the premium on political loyalty. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I think George H.W. Bush, for all his talents, I don't think he's anyone's idea of a grand strategist, someone who is really pushing the boundaries of the debate. I don't think he was necessarily the brightest guy in the world or whatever. But the point was that what he did excel at was being loyal. When the president asked him to do something, he always maintained friends. He was never really a sharp bureaucratic infighter. And, for better or worse, this is what gets rewarded in our system. So I think loyalty is one lesson here. But I think the other, and the more important one in many ways, is just the enormous premium that you can get for running for office, and even running for office when you lose. And in fact, I would even point out that if Bush had become a senator from Texas, I actually think that, in many ways, there's an argument to be made that he probably actually might have been worse off in terms of his presidential aspirations. I mean, who knows how he would have performed as a senator? Who knows if he would have had the requisite experience and skill and networks to become president. Okay, that's all.